All right, so we're on Matthew 16:21.
Yes.
Matthew 16:21. So we're in the middle of a chapter, but we had kind of come to the end of a section. In the last section, we just had Peter's confession of faith. Peter finally recognizes, Jesus asked them, "Who do men say that I am?" And they say, some say Elijah, some say the prophets, etc. And then he says, "Well, who do you say that I am?" And Peter finally speaks up and says, "You are the Son of God." And on that, Jesus promises to found his church. And here's the important part of that he promises to found his church not on Peter as a person, but on Peter's confession of faith. Peter's confession, "You are the Son of God." That's the confession of faith that the church is built on. This confession of that he is the Son of God. Then he tells them, as soon as Peter says this, that you are the Son of God, you are the Messiah, in other words, then Jesus instructs him to tell no one that he is the Messiah, that he is the Christ. And it continues 16:21. From that time, Jesus began to show to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day. So this is called the first passion prediction. First passion prediction. It's the first time that Jesus begins to show them what his true mission is. And so in other words, he's saying to Peter, "Yes, you're right. I am the Christ. I am the Messiah, the Son of God. But it's not what you think." And this is probably one of the most, I say it all the time, but I think if someone new to Christianity understands nothing about Christianity, the one thing that they have to understand is about this concept of the Messiah. That the Jews' concept of the Messiah was of an earthly king, an earthly military leader who is going to help them throw off the Romans, their Roman overlords. And so this is what Peter is thinking. He finally comes to the conclusion that Jesus really is the Messiah. Jesus is the one that they've been hoping for, who is going to lead them to victory, going to restore the independent kingdom of Israel. And now, as soon as Peter gets it that he's the Messiah, Jesus pulls a kind of bait and switch on him. It seems like he pulls the rug out from under Peter and says, "Yes, okay, I am the Messiah. I'm going to die." Can you imagine what Peter's reaction would be, right? So what does he say? He says, Peter took him, 16:22, then Peter took him, Jesus, aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." So you can imagine why Peter says this, because Jesus is saying, "I'm the Messiah, but I'm going to die at the hands of my own people." And Peter's like, "What are you talking about? You're not going to die. You're going to restore Israel. This will never happen to you." So Peter thinks he's being helpful here. He thinks he's being Jesus's friend, but he's actually trying to impede Jesus's already difficult path. Jesus knows what lays before him, what he has to do. And Peter is trying to inadvertently divert him from his path. But Jesus is single-minded. So he says in 16:23, "But he turned and said to Peter, 'Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me.'" An offense, I like the translation stumbling block. It's more literal, and it makes more sense. "You are a stumbling block to me." And it's also kind of a play on words, which rabbis did sometimes, because remember, he just named Peter the rock. And on this rock, I found my church. Now he's saying, "You're a stumbling rock. For you're not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." And so when he calls him, I always think of how we were at this clergy laity conference, and this priest was up there saying something in front of the crowd, and this photographer from this newspaper was like right in his face, taking pictures of him. Flashing, and the priest and this newspaper has a reputation for being kind of liberal, and this priest was kind of conservative, and so he's flashing him right in the face, and he says in Greek, "Get behind me, Satan."
He said it in Greek.
Yeah. But in Hebrew, Satan, Satana, in Greek, means simply adversary. So yes, he is in comparing him to the Satan, to the adversary, the evil one, the devil. But he's also saying that you're an adversary, you're someone who's coming to undo God's plan, to put a stumbling block in front of God's plan. So get behind me, you're a stumbling block to me. Because you're not thinking in the way that God thinks, you're thinking in the way that men think. So then 1624, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, and here the word is actually follow me. Just like it is later. So he says, if anyone desires to follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So in other words, that's what it means to follow Jesus, is to deny yourself and take up your cross. If you want to follow him, that's what it means. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? So this is what they say, the cost of discipleship. This is what this section is talking about, discipleship and the cost of discipleship. What we must be willing to sacrifice everything for Jesus. So Jesus is asking here, what point is there in temporarily possessing even the whole world when ultimately we're all going to die? So it's better, he says, to invest in our eternal life with him, even if it means forfeiting all the pleasures of this earthly life. He continues in 27, for the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. So here the scriptures are clear. Each will be judged according to his works, what he does, not on what he believes and thinks about things, but he'll be judged on his works, contrary to some Protestants. It's not just having the correct beliefs, it's not just saying a sinner's prayer, it's not just believing that Jesus is your Lord, but you're going to be judged on your works. So this day may seem far off to some, this day of the end that Jesus is talking about when he comes again in glory to judge the living and the dead. But Jesus, so this may seem far off, but Jesus is about to give us a foretaste of it here in just a few verses.
How do they justify what they believe in when it says it here?
Yeah,
It's your works, you're gonna be judged on your works.
yeah. They go more with, they tend to rely on what Paul says in Romans, when Paul emphasizes belief, but when Paul uses the word belief or trust or faith, he means, like Father Mike and I are both always saying, faith means faithfulness, is when Paul uses it. So it implies, we read it in English, faith, as just what I believe, but what it really is saying is faithfulness. So what you do because of that belief, that's what it really means. But the Protestants kind of misinterpret it, and they take, I would say that these kind of Protestants who believe who say it's just about what we believe, it's not about what we do, it's not about our works, are succumbing to a kind of minimalist view of Christianity. So they're going by the question of what's the minimum that I need to do to be saved, right?
Just to pass go.
Yeah. What's the absolute minimum I have to do? And so they read Paul and they say, well, I just need to believe.
But isn't it a combination of both though, Father, belief and works?
Yes, absolutely. But the works have to be generated because of our belief, right? Because if I believe that Jesus is offering eternal life, then and he tells me to have faith and to pray and fast and so on, which he's going to do here in a second. Then that requires that belief I have in Jesus translates to doing what he says, to keep what Jesus says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, right? So that belief in him translates to keeping his commandments. If it's just a belief in him that doesn't translate to any action, then it's not real faithfulness. It's just an intellectual kind of abstract belief, right?
Well, I mean, you can believe in him and go rob a bank. That's not,
Right.
contradicts itself,
Right, and I would say that Paul would say that's not real belief, right? Because you're not acting in accordance with what you believe. If I believe that Jesus is really the Son of God, then I'm going to act in accordance with his commandments. If I don't really believe it, then I'm going to do whatever I want and try to take advantage of whatever I can in this life and forfeit my eternal salvation.
But on the flip side of that coin is that good works doesn't always equate into belief.
Right, yeah,
Because there are a lot of people that do good works,
but don't believe.
but don't believe.
Right, like the whole humanism that we have in our world today that just says, well, you just be a good person, right? Just be a good person. But I mean, I would say if we have this balance between belief and works, and you need both, it's not an either or, it's a both and. But if I had to err on one side or the other, I would rather err on the side of works, because Paul says it's not the hearers of the law who are justified, but the doers of the law who are justified. And he talks about that there are some Gentiles who do God's will without even knowing what God's will is, and that they're somehow justified. So if anything, we should err on the side of works, right? But we need both. We need both belief and works.
Aren't there many religions which stress doing good to others
Yes.
and taking care of others?
Mhm. Yeah. But it's our motivation. What's our motivation for doing that? Is it our belief in Jesus, or is it just our belief in universal rights or humanism or something like that? All right. 28. Assuredly, I say to you, there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And then this is the end of chapter 16, which I think is a really unfortunate chapter break, because this verse really goes with what's following. It's a transition from what Jesus just said into the following. So, which is the transfiguration, Jesus's transfiguration, which we of course celebrate liturgically on August 6th. So it says here, so there are some standing here. So there was actually in the medieval times in the West, there was this legend of they called it the legend of the wandering Jew. And that there, have you heard of this?
Oh, yeah.
And that there was this Jew who was there when Jesus said this, who never died and who has continued to live in the Middle Ages. So, 1,000 years or whatever.
That's in Coleridge, in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Okay, good. Interesting. So, and this legend says that he's the one who wouldn't die before he sees Jesus come again in glory. But that's a total misunderstanding of the passage here. And part of what I think is obscured by the chapter break is that what Jesus is saying is there are some standing here who shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And then immediately he shows them the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So it's not that it hasn't happened yet. It happened right away afterwards. So there's no need for this legend of the wandering Jew who didn't die and is waiting for Jesus to come again. The disciples, the three, Peter, James, and John, see him coming in his kingdom. So it says here for the transfiguration, 17:1.
So it's not talking about us.
No, he's talking about
At
Peter,
all.
James, and John.
Okay.
But I mean, we too have the ability to see God coming in his kingdom before the end. There are many cases in the lives of the saints where they have visions of Jesus, or, you think of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, who is with Motovilov, who's transfigured in front of him. So there are cases where we still get to taste this glimpse of Jesus coming in his kingdom before he actually comes.
See, I always thought it meant that some of us would just be alive when we see him coming in.
Well,
this world.
That
That's
too,
what- yeah.
some of us will, but he
Yeah.
was specifically talking about Peter, James, and John are going to see me now coming in my kingdom.
Okay.
So and it says now after 6 days, Jesus took, so why does it allude to 6 days? So the 6 days alludes to Exodus 24, when God began to speak to Moses from the cloud on the mountain. And the seventh day the Sabbath is a prefiguring of our eternal rest. It's a prefiguring of the kingdom come, right? So this is what the 6 days is alluding to, this Sabbath rest, this coming of the kingdom. And on this seventh day, after 6 days, it says in verse 2, and he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. So the most obvious background for biblically literate hearers here would have been Moses's glorification on Mount Sinai from Exodus 34, where Moses' face radiated glory because of God's revelation of himself to Moses. And so what the disciples here are seeing in Jesus's transfiguration is Jesus's natural glory, his glory as God, finally unveiled for the disciples. His human flesh had kind of veiled his glory as God, but Jesus pulls up the veil and allows the disciples to see what the demons had already been seeing in Jesus's ministries. The demons already knew that Jesus was the Son of God. They confessed him many times before Peter confessed him. So the demons could see what Jesus really was, but now finally the disciples have the veil pulled back and they can see who Jesus really is as fully and truly God. And this is how he will appear when he comes in his kingdom. Through verse 3, and behold, Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with him. So Jewish people understood scripture as saying that Elijah had never died. Remember Elijah goes up in the heavens in the fiery chariot, and there's no record of him dying. So Jewish tradition held that he continued to live. God himself had buried Moses. So Moses died, and no one knew where he was buried, but he was buried. But Jewish people expected the return of both Elijah and Moses at the end of the age. And both of them heard from God on a mountain, on Mount Sinai. And here Jesus is again on a mountain, Mount Tabor. It doesn't say it in the text, but tradition identifies this with Mount Tabor, which is up in Galilee. So Jewish people expected Elijah and Moses to return at the end of the age. And here they are. So here they are in Jesus in his transfigured glory. This is an image of this is what's coming. The end of the age is already here proleptically, we say. Proleptically means prolepsis in Greek means to take ahead of time, to take before.
From the future.
From the future,
Yeah.
to borrow from the future today. All right, so Peter and James and John see this scene where Moses and Elijah have appeared to the transfigured Christ. And Peter, you can imagine they're all in shock. And Peter in verse 4 here says, then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. Here he's right. It's good for him to be here for this. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. All right, so this is kind of an odd thing to say if we don't understand the Old Testament background. So as a good Jew, Peter recognized how God's glory had appeared to Moses in the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. So this was the tabernacle, or the tent of meeting was the mobile structure that the Israelites had as they wandered through the wilderness for 40 years. And so that every time that they would move, they would set up again the camp. In the middle of the camp would be this tent or tabernacle, which was kind of the church building. And here, whenever Moses went to the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, which was all the people rose, and each man stood at his tent door, his individual family tent door. Each man stood at his tent door and watched Moses until he went into the tabernacle. This is quoting from Exodus 33:8. Now it came to pass, it says, when Moses entered the tabernacle, that the pillar of cloud descended and stood at the door of the tabernacle, and God talked to Moses. All the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the tabernacle door, and all the people rose and worshipped, each man at his tent door. Thus the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. That's Exodus 33. So, and this God would do habitually. This didn't just happen once, but every time Moses would go to the tent of meeting, God would meet him at the tent of meeting in this cloud and speak to him face to face. And each man of the Israelites would watch this from the door of his tent. So this is what Peter's thinking when he sees this scene here, is that he's seeing this cloud, he's seeing this this divine appearance, and he's speaking. So it's reminiscent of God speaking to Moses, 1,000 years before, 1,200 years before.
I have a question about the word tabernacle.
Yeah.
It doesn't always mean tent, does it?
It comes to mean, once the Israelites become settled, after the 40 years of wandering, then the idea of there's a bit of a question in the Old Testament of what happens to the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, and eventually it transforms into the temple. So it gets a permanent location. But you sense in the Old Testament some some ambiguity about this. God is not God didn't necessarily want a temple. He liked being in this mobile temple, accompanying this wandering people. But it was the Israelites who insisted on, we want to settle on the land, we want a king, we want a temple, we want to be like all the other nations. So God kind of allows this temple to be built, that then is the permanent structure of the tabernacle. But originally the tabernacle was a tent. A
Father,
place.
I have a question. I
Yeah,
thought once he was on the mountain for 40 days, God showed him the actual temple up above in heaven, and he said to make a copy, an identical copy, and to build him a tabernacle exactly as he just showed him up on the mountain. Was that not one of the God's commands to Moses, or am I mistaken, where he gave him exact measurements?
yes, he gave him measurements, but for the tabernacle, and then they take that and use that to build the temple later. But in Moses's time, there was no temple. In Moses's
No,
time,
I
it was
I
this
would
mobile tabernacle.
yeah,
Yeah,
but
he
the
did have very specific instructions for how it was to be set up and how it was to be constructed. He didn't just say, do whatever you want or have four white walls or,
and
he,
they followed that plan when they did build the temple, the actual temple. They followed that certain plan that God showed them, right?
yes.
According to what he showed them. That's why I just want to make sure I understood it correctly.
Yes.
Hmm.
So tabernacle, I think originally at root means tent. Because when it says some in the Gospel of John, where it says that Jesus came and dwelt among them, and the literal word there for dwelt is he came and tabernacled among them. That's the literal word. In other
It's a
words,
dwelling, it's an indwelling. It's really the indwelling.
yeah. All right, so 17:5. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." So the cloud of glory overshadowed the mountain in Exodus 24 and the tabernacle in Exodus 40. And it's the same Greek word from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, that Matthew uses here. And so the voice in this passage not only says, "This is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased," but he adds the words from Deuteronomy 18:15 when he says, "Hear him," or "Give heed to him, listen to him." And Deuteronomy 18:15, the context there is that God promises that at the end a prophet will arise like Moses. Give heed to him. And so Matthew is especially interested in presenting Jesus as this new Moses, right? That's why we're in the middle of, in this Gospel of Matthew, Jesus giving 5 major discourses. He's about to launch into the 4th of the 5. And these 5 major discourses represent the 5 books of the law that Moses gave. So you had Moses give 5 books of the law. Now Jesus is giving 5 new discourses, which are going to replace the law that Moses had given. So he's the new Moses
Who
that
did
was
they think of
promised.
this is the prophet that Jesus is talking about there?
Where?
I'm not reading, I was following your voice,
Yeah.
where he says there'll be a new prophet, pay attention to him.
Yes. Yeah. That's Jesus. Jesus is the new Moses. He's the new prophet.
So Jesus says that about himself?
No,
God says it.
God's voice says, "Hear him," and that's a quote from Deuteronomy 18, which the context of which is God promising a new prophet and to listen to him.
Sorry, sure.
Right.
That's just like at his baptism.
Yes,
He
exactly.
announces who he is.
Yes. All right, verse 6. And when the disciples heard it, the voice, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. And no wonder, this is the same voice that spoke everything into being, right? Now they're hearing this voice that spoke the world into being. And the cloud they saw was what they say in the Old Testament was the Shekinah, the Hebrew word for the divine presence. 7, but Jesus came, so they had fallen down, their faces to the ground. Verse 7, but Jesus came and touched them and said, "Arise, and do not be afraid." When they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. So these representatives of the Old Testament, and Moses and Elijah represent not only represent the two figures that the Jews expected to come back at the end of time, but they also represented Moses, the law, and Elijah, the prophets. Because at this time, remember, there really was no Old Testament as we think about it. They had the law, the prophets, and the writings. Those were the three kind of sections of the Old Testament, and the law and the prophets were considered the core of the Old Testament. The writings were kind of attached.
What was in the writings in history?
Yeah,
Mhm.
the history. All right, 17.
And Elijah doesn't just represent the prophets, it represents everybody else alive, is that correct?
Yeah, because he hadn't died, right?
Because he hadn't died.
They represent the living and the dead, everyone. All right, 17:9. Now, as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, Peter, James, and John, saying,
Hey, can I ask a question?
yeah,
It's maybe a stupid question. But before Jesus, everybody that died went to hell,
Hades.
Hades, yeah,
including Moses.
yeah.
So he just appeared from Hades.
Yeah, that's a good
It's
question.
just that's just what
Well,
I was just thinking when y'all were going back and forth.
you know, there's this text called the Ascension of Moses, which isn't part of the canonical Old Testament, but it was widely believed by the Jews of this time period. And in this text, the Ascension of Moses, Moses actually ascends to heaven. So it could be that they're drawing on this tradition that
Okay.
Moses had ascended into heaven.
Because when he was left on Mount Nebo in Jordan and was shown the Holy Land, it says that they never buried him, so they never saw him dead, and
Right.
doesn't have a tomb. Otherwise, the Jews would claim that as the holiest ground if he had a tomb there. But
Right.
actually, we, like you said, we don't know whether he was lifted up like Elijah was. So I think that's what they assumed, that he was taken up into heaven.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that makes sense. He didn't go to Hades.
Yeah.
then. Okay.
All right, so now as they're coming down the mountain, Jesus commands Peter, James, and John, saying, tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead. All right, so Jesus knew that they would be eager to share, at least with their fellow disciples, what had happened, right? This was an amazing thing that had just happened to him, but Jesus was afraid that this would stir up a kind of messianic enthusiasm, which he had been dealing with already, especially in the Gospel of John. It makes it clear that Jesus, when the crowds surround him after a miracle and want to make him the king, want to make him the earthly king, Jesus escapes from their midst. So the same thing here, Jesus is afraid that this is going to, if the story spreads, it'll encourage people to make him this earthly king, which he doesn't want. But what did he mean when he says, tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead? So the disciples, Peter, James, and John, they still don't get that he has to die and be raised on the third day. So what did they understand when he says until he is risen from the dead? They understood probably that he was talking about the general resurrection at the end of time, which the Jews generally, most of the Jews believed would happen, except for the Sadducees, that there would be this resurrection at the end of the age of all people. So the disciples are left to wonder, did he mean therefore that they could never tell anyone until the end of the age? Or was he implying that the end of the age was going to happen soon? But how could the end of the age happen soon? Because the scriptures say that Elijah has to come again. So they ask him, 17:10, and his disciples asked him, saying, why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? So if you're saying that the resurrection from the dead, this is how they misinterpret him. If you're saying that the resurrection from the dead is going in the end, the accompanies it is going to happen soon, where's Elijah? Because the scribes say that he has to come first. 17:11, Jesus answered and said to them, indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has come already, and they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is also about to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. Right, so Jesus is saying Elijah's already come, John the Baptist. So, and when we say this, we're not meaning that Elijah was reincarnated or something like that, but that John the Baptist came in Elijah's spirit. He came in Elijah's in the power, the authority, the spirit of Elijah. All right, 17:14. And when they had come to the multitude, so they're coming down the mountain, and there's this multitude gathered at the base of the mountain. When they had come to the multitude, a man came to him, to Jesus, kneeling down to him and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers severely. For he often falls into the fire and often into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him. So while Jesus is up on the mountain, remember he's given authority to the disciples, his own authority, but the disciples couldn't cure him. And so you can almost hear as Jesus is coming down the mountain. Well, there's two things. One, the scene is reminiscent of when Moses comes down from the mountain with the commandments, with the 2 tablets, right, of the commandments. He comes down the mountain and what does he find?
They worshiping idols.
The worshiping the golden calf. Even his own brother Aaron has the high priest has given into this and is leading the worship of the golden calf. And then Moses is so frustrated that he breaks the tablets, etc. So we get this scene kind of in Jesus coming down from the mountain. Here he finds this unbelief, both among the people and what he's going to say from his disciples, that they suffer from a lack of faith is why they couldn't cure this young boy. And you can almost hear the crowd murmuring at this point because they came with this they heard Jesus was a miracle worker, they heard his disciples were miracle workers, they come, this guy brings his son to be healed, and the disciples can't do anything. So you can almost hear the crowd kind of murmuring against Jesus. What does this say about Jesus if his disciples can't do this? Let's see. All right, 17:17. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. So then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, Why could we not cast it out? 17:20. So Jesus said to them, Because of your unbelief. For assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, so the mustard seed was it's not just something Jesus made up, this example, it was proverbial to say that a mustard seed, even though technically it's not the smallest of all seeds, it is a very small seed. And so when someone said a mustard seed, they meant a very small amount. If you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you. Mountains were considered kind of the most stable things that there were, right? And so you could even move a mountain, which is unmovable, if that nothing will be impossible for you. However, he says this kind of demon does not go out except by prayer and fasting. So he seems to say 2 different things here. One, he says you need faith to make this happen. And then he says this doesn't happen except by prayer and fasting. So he's equating faith with prayer and fasting, right? He's saying to do this, you need prayer, you need faith. And what does that look like? Prayer and fasting. So again, this connection between faith and faithfulness, between belief and action, right?
But before did the disciples fast? Did they fast before all this?
That's a good question because Jesus says, earlier, he says that the disciples can't fast while the bridegroom is still with them.
Yeah.
Right,
that's
but
what I-
after the bridegroom leaves, they will fast.
Yeah,
So we get the sense that maybe he's saying that in the future, this is how you'll do it. But there's an interesting problem in the manuscripts, in the very earliest manuscripts of Matthew, it just says, however, this kind does not go out except by prayer. And then in the later manuscripts, and in the vast majority of existing manuscripts, it says prayer and fasting. So we're not exactly sure which one is original.
Did the
What's
Jews never fast for any reason?
They fast.
The Jews? No, the Jews fasted. Yeah,
Yeah,
2
they,
days that we don't fast on.
yeah, the Pharisees fasted on Monday and Thursday, for example. So the Jews definitely fasted, and then of course they fasted once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. All right, 17:22. Now while they were staying in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be betrayed into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and the 3rd day he will be raised up." And they were exceedingly sorrowful. So this is what we call the second passion prediction. Again, Jesus tells them what's going to happen, and this time, it says that they're not so much confused as sorrowful. So they're starting to get that something is going to happen to him, and but they still don't understand about the third day he being raised up. They still don't know what that could possibly mean. 1724. When they had come to Capernaum, which again is up in Galilee on the Sea of Galilee, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" So what is the temple tax? So the temple tax was a Jewish tax, not a Roman tax. The Romans had nothing to do with this. The Romans refused to get involved with basically, when Pontius Pilate at this point had been governor of Judea for about 6 years by this point. And when Pontius Pilate first came to Judea 6 years previously, he, out of his ignorance, had tried to set up, like all good Romans did, they tried to set up a statue of the emperor in the temple, right? Because that's what one did. You would go into the pagan temple and you would add a statue of the emperor so you could worship him as well. But Pilate, in his ignorance, tries to do this to the Jerusalem temple, which of course doesn't go over very well, right? The Jews don't appreciate that, so he has to remove the statue from the temple, and the whole thing caused him a lot of problems, right? It kind of soured his relationship with the Jews, and he's still kind of trying to recover from that 6 years later.
Who was the emperor? Forgotten.
Oh, good question. At this time. I don't know. I'd have to look it up. Yeah, because there's a lot of, probably, well, I have to look it up. So what's the temple tax? So Pilate had basically washed his hands of the temple. He after this debacle, he said, "I'm not getting involved in the temple anymore. You guys run it however you're going to run it, but don't ask me for anything, right? Just be completely separate. Don't ask me for anything." So the Jews tried to collect this tax for the upkeep of the temple. And basically any Jew who was 20 years old, any male Jew who was 20 years or older was expected to pay this tax, but there was no way of enforcing it because the Romans wouldn't have anything to do with it. So it was basically a voluntary tax to show, and a pious Jew would pay it to show that he was aligning himself with the temple, with the priests, with the tradition, etc. You can almost think about it like, almost kind of like how in the US we used to think about dues at church, right? A lot of people had that same kind of mentality that I paid my dues, $250 or whatever, and that entitled me to get buried and, or whatever.
All the
Privileges, right? So you could kind of think of it as something like that, it's voluntary, but it showed that you were aligning yourself with the church or with the temple.
You said it was 20 years or older. I thought it was a lot younger than that at some point.
That's what I found, was it said if you were 20 years or over, you were expected to pay the tax. And it said also if you were indigent, if you were homeless or a beggar, then you were exempted from the tax.
Maybe along with stewardship, we should have the cathedral
The
tax.
temple, the cathedral tax, yeah.
I think when I first came here, which was about 35 years ago, I was astonished to hear that if you didn't pay something, and Charles can probably verify this better than I can, that you couldn't be buried.
Yeah,
Correct.
that's
That's
correct.
what's called good standing,
Good standing,
belonging to the club.
In all honesty, that's the way it's supposed to be today.
yeah,
Unless you're a steward of this church, meaning you make a pledge and you pay what you pledge, you're not supposed to receive the sacraments of weddings and
right,
funerals and things. You
right,
have to be a good steward
yeah.
of the church.
But what if you're not?
Technically in the past, I think they would enforce this. They wouldn't
They were
bury you.
refusing.
Yeah,
They were
but now,
refusing.
now we don't do that. Now we
Yeah.
look the other way and.
Or you look at case by case. And it's-
Yeah, there might be some reason that the person wasn't able to pay, et cetera, but I've had cases that, an older lady, I remember, she was developing dementia. And every time I would go visit her, the only thing she would want to know is, did I pay my stewardship? Did I pay my stewardship? Or she would call it dues. Did I pay my dues? Because she knew that she was going to die soon, and she wanted to make sure that she was buried in the church. So the only thing she would ask me every time I visited was, did I pay are my dues up to date? And I would tell her, yeah, it's fine, don't worry about it.
Can't they, I mean, for like, I don't know about funerals, but at baptisms and weddings and what have you, can't they pay at the time if they don't happen to live
Yes.
or something?
Yeah, that's what happens in practice, yeah.
And I thought the difference then, there's not a minimal amount.
Yeah,
So when
there's
we
not.
called it dues, there
That's
was a
right, back
minimal
then.
amount.
Right, now
And
there's,
now
You had
it's what you,
to pay.
whatever
Right.
you contribute.
right,
The church wouldn't
Whatever.
survive 1 month with the dues.
yeah. All right, so this tax that they're asking Peter, they come and ask Peter, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? Because remember, Jesus has already had said some controversial things about the temple, and he's going to say more controversial things about the temple when he goes to Jerusalem, like saying, for example, I will destroy this temple and in 3 days build it back, right? And ends up what they get him on. That's one of the charges that sticks against him at the Passion, was that he was anti-temple. So there's a possibility here that they're trying to catch him already and saying, okay, does he have an anti-temple attitude toward the tax as well? This is something we can use against him.
Can I,
Uh,
Father, can
yeah.
you? Well, it's on my mind. I'm always just going back to something we tried to answer earlier. I remember that Jesus came during the Pax Romana, which was the Roman peace, which was 40 years of peace, and I think it was under Augustus Caesar.
Augustus, yeah.
And I just wanted, it stayed on my mind since I'm history minded all the time. But isn't that, it was under Augustus Caesar that Jesus existed at that time?
Yeah, but I think Augustus was alive during Jesus's birth, but I think by this time Augustus had died.
Had died well, I thought he ruled for 40 years.
Right, but I think he started in like 28 BC or something like that. So he would have ended after Jesus's birth, but
Okay.
before his adulthood year.
Okay.
I think I'd have to look it up. All right, so this tax, what it actually says, and literally what it says in the text is 2 drachmas. So the receive the temple tax means those who receive the 2 drachmas is what it literally says, and 2 drachmas equaled 2 denarii, which equaled a half shekel, which was the actual amount of the tax. Because remember, in the temple, they couldn't accept foreign money, because why? Because the Romans and the Greeks usually had the image of the emperor on one side of the coin and a pagan god on the other side of the coin. So they couldn't receive this foreign money because it was idolatry. So that's why you had all these money changers around the temple to collect the temple tax, was because people would have to bring their money that they actually used, which is Roman or Greek money, and trade it in, exchange it for Jewish money, which was a shekel or a half shekel.
So convert the money.
So 2 drachmas equaled exactly a half shekel, and 4 drachmas or 4 denarii equaled exactly a shekel.
Are the drachmas and the denarii, are those Roman?
Drachmas is Greek and denarii is Roman.
Yeah,
So,
Okay, and they couldn't use those.
right, and they couldn't
The
use either
shekel
of
is
them.
Hebrew.
Right, but they all had translatable value, right? So 2
Mhm.
drachmas equal to half shekel. So around the month of March, every Jew over 20 had to pay this, or was asked to pay this tax to support the temple. And this 2 drachmas per person, or half shekel per person. And in Jesus' day, most Jews would have paid it. The Sadducees, however, which were the priestly class who didn't believe in the resurrection, they disapproved of the temple tax, interestingly, because they were the priests and the most invested in the temple, but they didn't believe in this tax, interestingly. And the Essenes, which was another big group of Jews, who probably started the Dead Sea Scrolls community, they believed that you only needed to pay this tax once in a lifetime, not every year. We have people who believe that now about this. Some don't believe in it, some believe maybe once in a lifetime pay it.
Augustus Caesar died in 14 AD.
Okay,
And Tiberius, is that right?
Tiberius, that's what I was gonna
He-
say.
I just looked it up.
Okay.
He was the emperor. after
He's the
him.
one that Mary Magdalene appeared to.
Yes, yep, according to tradition, yep. All right, so they asked Peter, is your teacher gonna pay this tax? And there's probably a little kind of hidden agenda in this question. And at 1725, Peter said yes. So Peter hastily answers yes without asking Jesus. And then it goes on to say, and when he had come into the house, Jesus anticipated him. So just like the prophets would often know what someone was going to say before they said it, so Jesus knows what Peter's going to ask. And so before Peter says anything, Jesus anticipated him, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers? And Peter said to him, from strangers. Jesus said to him, then the sons are free. So in other words, tax collectors didn't go to the wife and kids of Caesar, of the emperor, and demand taxes, right? They went to the peasants and they forced the peasants to pay up. And that's what peasants were for, was cheap labor and taxes, right? That's about the only thing the only reason the Romans kept them around was for cheap labor and to pay their taxes. So so the sons of the emperor are free. And so Jesus is saying then the sons are free. And who's he? He's the son of God. So he shouldn't be taxed for the upkeep of his father's house. That's what he's saying. But interestingly, he implies that Peter is included in that as well, which makes you think of Paul. Paul says in his letters that we are all adopted sons of God. Jesus is God's son by nature, but we're sons by grace through Jesus. So Jesus includes Peter here as a son who doesn't really need to pay the tax. But 27, it says, nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, and take the fish that comes up first. And when you have opened its mouth, you will find a piece of money. Actually, literally it says there, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and you. So the tax was a half shekel per person. Jesus tells them, go find this shekel, full shekel, which will pay for both you and me. So, and there, interestingly, Jesus doesn't want to give offense. He doesn't want, by not paying it, because he realizes they're trying to test him here, whether he's going to be anti-temple or not. So he pays it, but really he doesn't pay it because it's not his money. It comes out of nowhere. It comes out of this fish. So kind of they don't pay it since they are exempt as sons. And that's the end of this section here. So the next section, starting with 18:1, starts a new section, which is the fourth of the 5 major discourses. And this fourth discourse is on discipleship. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? And it focuses on humility, righteousness, being just, and forgiveness. And these are the essence of Christian discipleship. So 18:1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? All right, so it might seem like this is an unusual question to bring up now, but because Peter has just been singled out by Jesus as, saying that his confession will be the rock upon which Jesus will build his church, and Jesus pays for Peter here, including him as a son. So it leads the disciples to wonder, is Peter the greatest? Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And so this whole next section is trying to answer this question of who's the greatest. Because, and St. John Chrysostom says, because the disciples had observed that the same tax had been paid for Peter and the Lord, they inferred that Peter might have been set over all the other apostles. Thus they asked who is greater in the kingdom of heaven. So Jesus answers by saying in 18:2, then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them. And here, so you know what's coming. There's this story about Jesus taking a child and saying we must become like children. But there's a danger here of reading this anachronistically. In our day, children are, compared with the rest of history, children are more elevated in our day than at any other time in history, right? At this time in history, 2,000 years ago, children were basically had the same social status as slaves, right? They had no rights. They had no social status. I heard one commentator was saying that they were just a step above like stray cats and dogs, right? They had nothing, right? They weren't good for anything in terms of like productivity. They couldn't pay taxes, The interesting thing here is that the Aramaic word for child is the same word for slave or servant, right? So when Jesus says, then Jesus called a little child to him, it could also, the hearers would also have heard a servant, a slave. And this is going to be important because Jesus is going to equate these little children with his own servants, with his own disciples, right? So he's saying to be a disciple of Christ is to be a child. It's the same thing. So child here is a metaphor for any servant of Jesus, any follower of Jesus. And we are called to welcome all of them because they're our fellow Christians. So Jesus sets the child in the midst of them, verse 3, and said, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." So he's answering their question. Is Peter the greatest? Who's the greatest? He's saying this little child, the smallest and most insignificant of my servants, of my disciples, if he humbles himself, will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And then he says in verse 5, "Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me." So when we receive a fellow disciple of Christ in the name of Christ, we're receiving Jesus. Does that make sense? So we're called to be welcoming to our fellow Christians.
And
18.
that ties very directly to converts and converting.
Yeah,
Very
sure.
directly.
Anyone who's a Christian, we have to receive in his name.
And that's why being a godmother or a godfather is really a blessing to the person who carries that child
Sure.
and cares
Yes.
about their Christian upbringing.
Yes, we're receiving them in Christ's name, and that we're receiving Christ himself when doing that. All right, so verse 6, it says, "Whoever causes one of these little ones, these disciples of mine, who believe in me, to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea." All right, so the millstone he's talking about here is not just a little stone that women use to grind wheat, but like a millstone that was this big circle that was turned by a donkey. So, you can imagine this huge millstone weighing hundreds of pounds kind of plopped around your neck, right? It wouldn't be good. You almost think of what, like the mob, the concrete shoes of the mob or something like that. 7, woe to the world because of offenses. Again, this word is stumbling blocks. Temptations is what he's talking about. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes, by whom the stumbling block comes. So in other words, Satan tyrannizes the world with all of these obstacles, temptations, stumbling blocks on our path to follow Jesus. And it's inevitable that some Christians will be tripped up by them, but woe to that man who causes another to sin. All right, 18:8. "If your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire." All right, so generally, St. John Chrysostom, he says that this is a metaphor. The metaphor of cutting off limbs is really, he says, about friends and relatives who constantly cause temptation. For Chrysostom says, nothing is so harmful as bad company. So sometimes we have to cut people out of our lives who are causing us to sin. But there have been cases, rare cases in the history of Christianity where, like Origen, for example, who lived around the year 200, it's said that he actually castrated himself because of this passage, because he was afraid that this member would cause him to sin in lust. So it's said that he actually castrated himself. So he took this literally, but that's not the tradition of the church. And Origen was eventually condemned as a heretic.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
What a bad
But
outcome.
couldn't that be anything that keeps us
Yeah.
from Christ?
Yes.
It
Yeah.
could be,
There.
an addiction to anything.
Yeah.
Or
That's
whatever,
that's
or
a
any
good
kind
point.
of passion or addiction or whatever.
Good point. Yeah, and we
That's
have
a stumbling block.
to be like
The 7 sins.
we have to have this almost violent anger toward anything that causes us to sin. We have to want to cast it off from us, to cut it off. Even though
Father, can I ask
Yeah.
about Origen? I know he was a great writer and theologian. Can you just a little bit tell me why they finally said he was a heretic? Do you know what is the issue that stopped them? Now,
Yes.
in the Coptic Church, I don't think is considered a heretic.
Yeah, you could be right, because I think he was condemned at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and the Coptic Church stopped following us at the Fourth Ecumenical Council. So it could be, you're right. Yeah, Origen was he lived around the year 200, so he's an early Christian father. And by all accounts, he was a prolific commentator on the scriptures. A lot of his commentary on the scriptures exists. A lot of it has been influential. And in fact, I remember my professor at Brown would always talk about Origen had a crew of 50 scribes following him around constantly, just recording anything that he said, right? Can you imagine 50 secretaries following you around, hanging on your every word? That's how famous he was at the time. That's how brilliant he was. But unfortunately, what happened, to answer Nejwa's question, was he became very influential in later Christianity, especially among certain monks of the Egyptian desert. And this is my interpretation, and most scholars' interpretation, is that they kind of twisted his teachings and took it down a heretical path. And so when the church they really condemned Origen's teachings as heretical, the ones that had kind of come through this certain monastic tradition of the Egyptian desert. They declared that heretical. And then by association, Origen kind of became a pariah. But some people argue that we should kind of rehabilitate him, that he wasn't that bad, and it was really more his followers that gave him a bad name. But that's
he was brilliant. I've read some of his writings. He was brilliant as a theologian. It's unfortunate that's what happened many years after his death.
Yes.
I remember when I was very first Orthodox over at I was first Orthodox here, but then when I was first at St. Simeon, Father Alex gave me something to read, handed me an Origen.
Yeah.
I didn't read it. I couldn't. It didn't make any real sense to me.
Yeah.
It's a bit stiff.
It needs some interpretation. Yeah. All right. So, right. So 1810, take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones. So, traditionally, this is understood as children, but that's kind of a modern interpretation. Really, what Jesus is talking about is any one of his disciples. When he's talking about children, any one of his servants, his disciples. Take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones, even the least significant of my disciples. For I say to you that in heaven, their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. So they're guardian angels, which are assigned to us at baptism. And there's a specific prayer that we say in the beginning of the baptismal service. We read the exorcism prayers in the narthex, and toward the end of those prayers, we pray to assign a radiant angel to the person's life at baptism, so that at baptism this guardian angel is attached to us in baptism. And Jesus is saying that guardian angel always is in direct contact with God himself. Such is our importance of even the most insignificant and humblest of Christian disciples, that they have immediate direct access to God through their guardian angel. All right, 1812. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains to seek the one that is straying? And if he should find it, assuredly, I say to you, he rejoices more over that sheep than over the 99 that did not go astray. Even so, it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. So 100 was an average size flock in Palestine at this time. And there's all kinds of examples from Greek and Jewish literature of shepherds who would leave their flock or herd to look for a lost animal. A shepherd could leave his flock with other shepherds with whom he worked while he went and searched for the one missing. And the fathers here say, like Chrysostom says, do not hate. So, yeah. He says, don't hate those who have gone astray, since it is possible for them to change. Not one of these little ones who believe in Christ should be despised. For their sake, the Son of God came down from heaven and saved them by his passion. It was for this that he took on the body of our human weakness, which is similar to what Paul says. Remember, Paul is pleading with the Corinthians and says, don't you know that Christ died for your brother, your weaker brother, who is maybe not doing things the way you would do them, but Christ died for them too. So that's what they're saying here, that Jesus values even every single one of his disciples. And that's probably a good place to stop. It's 11:30, and then we're going into the next section at 18:15. It goes into this section that Jesus, this fourth section, this fourth speech is talking about discipleship, and now he's going to go into what we call rules for the organization of the community, right? So he's going to go into church organization this year. He's going to talk about what you do when a fellow Christian is sinning against you. So that will be next week. We'll pick up at 18:15.
What did you say were the three aspects of discipleship? Humility, forgiveness, and what?
Righteousness.
Righteousness.
Anybody have any comments, questions on Zoom, or here?
Yes, Father, I have a question there, or just a clarification. There was a time when the persecutions came about and many people could not, actually did deny Christ. And then when they wanted to come back to the church, those who have not denied Christ wanted to cast them out and leave them out of the
Right.
church. This was in maybe 4th century, 4th century. Can you enlighten us on that?
Yeah, so this was more like 3rd century, but before Constantine, while there was still persecutions going on in Christianity. So yeah, 3rd, 4th century, 200s before Constantine, in 313. There was lots of persecutions of Christians. So yeah, many Christians apostatized during the persecutions, or they offered incense. Usually the test of a Christian was, will you offer incense to the emperor and worship his genius, worship his spirit? And many Christians did this, and then they were actually given what was called a libellus. It was a certificate that the government would issue saying that you had sacrificed to the emperor, right? So you were clear. Now, what some Christians did was some actually offered, they said that they remained Christian in their heart, but out of fear for losing their lives or their property or whatever, they would offer this incense and get this libellus. Some Christians didn't want to do it, but still wanted to protect themselves, so they actually forged libeluses. We know that happened. Forged these certificates that said they had sacrificed to the emperor. And then the question was, after the persecutions ended, shortly thereafter, like the last great persecution was around 303, and then only in 313, Constantine declares that Christianity is no longer illegal. So,
Edict of Milan?
yeah, in the Edict of Milan. So you have these people who back in 303 had sacrificed in order to avoid being killed. And now 10 years later, it's no longer illegal to be Christian. And so the question is, all right, what do we do with these people? The church's question, well, how do we receive them back? If so, how? And this is when it came up, the idea of the confessors. So those Christians who had been imprisoned for their faith in Christianity, for their refusal to a sacrifice to the emperor. They were in prison, and they started to hold a special kind of power in the Christian community that they started saying, well, look, I didn't sacrifice. I've suffered in prison for Christ. And the people who had sacrificed started going to them in prison and asking basically for their prayers and intercessions. And the confessors would say, I forgive so-and-so. I take on their sin, right? And so the church kind of used this as a mechanism to allow people who had lapsed back into the church. But then there was a hardcore element of the church who said, no, we can't allow them back in under any circumstances. But that ended up being the minority view. But the majority view was that we should allow them back in. But there had to be this mechanism through the confessors. And then it was then when the confessors no longer existed, you know, once Christianity was legalized, the confessors in prison had all died. Then this ability to reintegrate somebody into the church after a serious sin fell to the apostles and their successors, the bishops and priests, who had the ability to bind and loose whatever on earth as it is in heaven. So then this is when confession started to develop, along with this confessor movement.
And it wasn't until about 380 is when Christianity became the official religion of the church under Theodosius.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Father.
I